Welcome back, everyone. We're going to do something a bit different than normal. I'm going to bring you through the process that I go through when I'm developing a new feature in one of my projects. This will be a complete start to finish video on how I contribute to open source projects. I'll bring you through reading the initial feature request, developing the code itself, testing the code, adding our changes in Git, and finally submitting the pull request itself. This is an honest look at how I contribute to open source, so there will be mistakes along the way, but I'm sure that we'll get through it. So sit back, relax, and enjoy because today I'm doing all the work. So let's get started. And what I have here is one of the projects that I wrote and maintain. Let's take a look at issues. And at the top here, we see we have a latest issue. This one states that broker does not provide a way to pass non-trivial variables as an argument. So I'm going to go ahead and read through the description of this and get my take on it. All right, so I've taken a look through the description and I've determined that some of the aspects of the reporter's specification are legitimate. This part at the top here, we're talking about not being able to pass in specific data structures in JSON format, is technically possible. However, he's right that formatting it is a little bit difficult. So for the intent of the enhancement that I'm going to focus on, going to be allowing people to pass in file-based arguments. This part right here is particularly interesting for me because if added, it would let people pass in multiple arguments based on a specific file where the keys or the actual arguments themselves correspond to the key in the file, and the values for those arguments will be the nested data structures under each of those. Additionally, I think it would also be nice if we could support putting file-based values for arguments passed on the command line here. So instead of him saying my arg and trying to format the particular data, he could say my arg, and then for example, args.json, or we could even support a YAML format as well. So I've decided to take on this issue. What I'll do next is assign it to myself. Now the assignee is me. I'm also going to review the labels and see if anything applies to them. I've selected enhancement. Good first issue, maybe. It depends on how good a newcomer might be on picking up the flow of the project, as well as dealing with file input and passing arguments. Aside from that, we're not going to select help wanted because I'll be taking it in. Definitely not invalid a question. So we're going to stick with the enhancement label. And this looks good. We see the changes here. See that I'm assigned. I added the enhancement label. And now we'll switch over to VS Code to actually flesh this out. So now I've moved over to VS Code and I have the broker project open. First things first, let's go ahead and fetch anything upstream. And then also rebase against upstream master to make sure that we're up to date with the latest changes. Perfect, we're up to date. So here's what I'm thinking. This is one of the commands I want to enable this functionality on. Checkout command. What I'm likely going to do is add a new option in here where people can pass in, say, an args file. But I also want them to be able to pass in file-based arguments for any kind of arbitrary command that can be passed in as well. If I give myself a little bit more room, you can see that we have our context settings for click set to allow extra arguments, as well as ignore unknown options. What this does is we don't have to define every possible argument that can be passed into the CLI. We can allow these extra arguments, and we can pass them via the context into the deeper logic of a program itself. For this change, I'll likely want to do that kind of processing after this step here, before we move on to potentially forking it if we're doing background type functionality, spinning off a different process. And right now, I'm pretty sure that that should live within helpers, just in case we want to use some of that functionality elsewhere. Let's move over to the helpers file. Currently think I'm going to add two functions to this helper file. One that handles resolving the file arguments, and another that just does general file loading, and one that I want to be relatively flexible to handle both JSON and YAML file type input. But if we go down here, we can see that we have another method that deals with loading data in from the file. So if we add that function that's able to load files in, including YAML files, then instead of loading that in manually in this function, we can just call that load file method. With that in mind, I'm going to start just above this load inventory function and just go ahead and flesh out a load file function. Alright, I think this load file function should work. It accepts a file. This can either be a path object, a Python path object from pathlib, or it can be a file string. From there, it's going to check to make sure that the file actually exists on disk, or check to see that if the suffix of the file or what's commonly called the extension of the file is not JSON, YAML, or YML, then we're going to go ahead and print out a warning and return nothing at all. The reason why I want to allow this is that if someone's passing an argument that belongs to a remote file system, something that is actually valid in the context of whatever they're trying to execute, I don't want to stop that behavior. What I'm doing next is what I'm calling setting up the loader. So the loader is going to be either JSON or YAML. These are the libraries themselves. They both share a common load argument, so we can just alias them as loader and then call loader.load, which is effectively the same as calling JSON.load or YAML.load. Now for my case, I don't need to pass any additional arguments in JSON loader. However, for YAML, I do need to specify that the loader class is going to be YAML's full loader. And then finally, we actually get to the business of opening the file, reading the data, and then passing it along. If nothing's actually read in, I'm still going to return an empty list because this is the behavior that I've already defined down here in this function. And now that I've effectively replicated the same functionality that's defined in here, I can simplify this portion quite a bit. I can just delete all this, say imp data is equal to file inventory file. Beautiful. Okay, now to define what may be the more complicated helper function, which is the one that's going to resolve our file argument. Let's see if I can write this one out. Okay, I think this function is going to do what I want. it's going to take in broker args, which I should always be passing in a dictionary for that. So I'm going to iterate over the key and value for everything that's passed in as broker args. And if a path is passed in, which I'm planning on having the argument defined in click to be a path, so that will match this first check. Or we have a larger conditional over here where if a string is passed in and the last 4 characters of the string are JSON, YAML, or .ym, meaning that should be the suffix of the file, then what we're going to try to do is load that file. We're going to store that value to data. So if the load actually returns something, then we're going to move on to the next section. If it doesn't, then we're just going to store whatever is. And now that I think about it, there is a potential case where we could trigger this condition that'll put us to the point where we want to try to load the file, but we don't get anything back. And in that case, let's just go ahead and do a safety where we just put the key and val into final args. Okay, so if it's the args file, so if the key is args file, that means it's passed in via the CLI's args file argument. If that's the case, we're going to allow a little bit higher level data structure, meaning the top level keys of the file would become effectively top level arguments to the broker itself. Otherwise, we're going to put that data inside the key. So this is in the event that someone passes in an arbitrary argument with their complex data being stored in a file. All right, now I'm at the point where I'm going to start manually testing this. So I'm going to create a file with some test data in. And in this file, I'm going to copy the example data directly from the issue itself. That way we know at the minimum, we're covering the case that this person is wanting. So let's paste this into the new file. And then we're going to go ahead and save this, and we'll save it under the test directory under data, and we'll call this file broker args JSON. This is a little bit ugly. We'll go ahead and format it. Speaking of formatting, this, as you may have noticed, is quite long. And the formatting isn't that great either. So I'm going to use VS Code's format method to use Black's formatter to format the code with this. This way I can just write it out however I want and then let the auto formatter worry about making things extra. Okay, let's save this. Now since I'm working with this locally, I'm going to update the package locally. And then we'll just go ahead and load in from broker. Import. Okay, so now we should have our helpers.load file. Yep. And also resolve file args. So first let's see what it looks like when we just load the data in data equal to helpers dot load file. And that file location is going to be tests data broker args. Okay, no obvious issues right now. So let's go ahead and take a look. Okay, and it looks like everything looks good. We've got our dictionary with the top level keys being my arg and my second arg. And if we go into my arg, we see that nested data structure. Okay, this is exactly what we. All right, so now we know that the JSON loader is looking good. What we can do is let's just go ahead and port this data from JSON over into. So import YAML. This time we're actually going to import YAML, little thing, and then open a new file. So we'll say with open tests data autocomplete, so we can place the file extension right F. We're going to say YAML dump, pass in the file, and then data. Oh, that didn't work. Why is dump? Oh, I think it should be data and then the file. we can check that. Dump. Yeah, data and the stream itself. So let's go ahead and reverse that real quick. Data, file. Okay, no errors. Now we should see a new file in this directory called brokerargs.yaml. Perfect. Let's repeat that earlier test where we said data equals, instead of JSON, we're going to say YAML. We'll actually call this data2, just to make sure that it loads everything. Data2. Let's do a quick check that they're the same. Data equals 2. Oh, because I spoke in a question mark. True. All right, perfect. We're getting the same exact result back from our YAML and our JSON files. Let's now try this resolve file args method as well. So we're going to have to come up with a broker args dictionary. I'll just write that out real quick. Okay, now we have a bargs dictionary. So we have test, keep, another, things. So these shouldn't be changed by the resolve file args. But we do have our args file argument, which should put the data that's in this args file on the top level of the resulting dictionary that's passed back. And then complex arg should nest everything under complex arg. Let's see how it does. Helpers dot resolve file arg bargs as the dictionary in. Okay, so we have test and keep, another thing. Then we have, yes, these top level elements, my arg and my second arg. Perfect. We no longer see this args file key in here. Exactly what we should be seeing is it actually being replaced by the data that was loaded from the file. And then under complex arg, we have all the content of that file. It's beautiful. So I think we're good with these two helper methods. But just to be sure, let's write some tests so we can actually describe the functionality that we think we should be getting with this, and actually have tests that we can run to ensure that that is the behavior we're expecting. Okay, at this point we have some basic tests that are available. We've got testing that we can load our JSON file, our YAML file, that we're not going to actually load anything from a file that doesn't exist. And finally, our resolve test is in here. We did something similar to before. We have a value that we want to remain exactly this. We have our args file, which args file should not exist returned. Instead, we should get those top level arguments stored within this broker args file. To actually verify this, we should make a new assertion. Let's do it based on this my second arg. That should equal foo. We'll say assert new args, key of arg. Now we're making sure that we have that top level insertion. And then complex args should match everything that is underneath this key within broker args data. We'll do our test discovery. Okay, so we should have our new test helpers file, and let's run all of these. Perfect, they all passed. So we had 4 passed within 0.09. All right, I think at this point we're ready to incorporate that into our commands.py. There's a bit more room here, and I'll do that now. Okay, so I've added in a new option called args file, which should be a type that is a click path. So this is actually going to pass in Python path object. It's also going to make sure that it exists. So we have double layers of protection here. Help text that I put is a JSON or YAML file mapping arguments to values. Down here, I explicitly add the args file key and value to the compiled broker args. So this is important because we are passing along everything that was in the context. Remember that broker does accept arbitrary arguments. So this way you can put everything together one data structure and eventually pass it along to the VM broker class itself. But before that, we're going to resolve those file arguments, overriding what was stored in broker args. So if we save this and then update, we should see the new help text in there. Broker, check out, help. We have that args file description, and then in the options, we see we have our --args file, which is a path type. And this is also applied to execute, which is the other function apply it to down below. We have the same thing, args file, same addition there, and the exact same thing here and there. So if we do help for execute, we see we have the same thing. So at this point, I'm going to have to switch to testing it against our production systems. So anything that shows something that could be potentially sensitive, you're not going to see in the video, but I'll get a command ready and see how it turns out. Okay, so this is the resulting command that I'm going to execute. We have broker checkout, skin and nick, that's completely unrelated. And then we have our args file mapping to our test data. And then our extra argument is going to be the other testing argument file. So I'll run this. It is going to put out some URLs that I can't show you. I'm going to have to clear the output and then sanitize the next part that I'm going to show in this video. Okay, bringing you guys back in after sanitizing some things. We can see underneath the broker args, this is basically the dictionary that broker received and then passed along. You see what we executed as extra at the top here with the data correctly filled in underneath of it. And then we also see my second arg and my arg as top level elements of the data structure that was also passed in. So it looks like we're good. Now the remaining things that I have to do to get this ready are to add some doc strings to these helper functions, update our version in setup.py, as well as update the history, and also we'll update the README as well to give a bit more visibility to the feature that we're adding in with this change. So I'll do that now. Alright, so I made a number of changes to the files. I updated the version to 0.10. Also added that entry to history.md file. And then finally, I updated the README to include a description of the newly, and of course, added some basic doc strings. So all that's left to do is deal with the Git process. Check our Git. We see we have modified these files and we are adding all these files in as well. This all looks good to me. So we'll add them. And if we check our Git status, you'll see that everything that was untracked is now tracked. Just to be extra sure, you can do a git diff. Enter too soon, a git diff against upstream / master, and manually review all the changes that would be passed up in pull request. I'll just skim through these now. Okay, git. Okay, the diff looks good. Now we'll add our commit message. Commit message is largely written. Now we'll just annotate that this fixes number 87, the issue filed against broker, which will then automatically link those two together. I'm going to submit the pull request to the upstream broker. So we'll save that, push. And now in GitHub, we see that we are one commit ahead of Satellite QE's master. So we'll prepare a pull request. We'll just do one final check through the changes. And it looks like we missed some ending new line characters in argsfile.json, as well as broker args.json. Let's take care of that. Push back up to origin master. And now if we refresh this page, you see that we're good to go. All right, I'm going to click create pull request. We see that, of course, the title and then description is populated by the commit message that I wrote. Why it's important to write, pretty good commit message, because not only does it help you to review history later, but it reduces the amount of work you need to do when you pull request, because these fields will automatically be populated. So we'll create the pull request. I'll request one of our maintainers to review this. I'll add a label of enhancement. Go. Everything's starting to get populated. We've got our sanity checks that need to be ran. So the GitHub action is progress, and then our Travis job will also run in due time. Now, if you go back to our issues and we see the one that we're trying to resolve, bottom here, we see our pull request linked bottom. Beautiful. And this is where I leave you guys. The rest is up to the review process and seeing if any changes need to be made before this new feature merged into the product. If you have any questions on anything I showed during this video, please let me know down in the comments. I know it's been a while since my last video, but I'm hoping to maintain a more consistent schedule. But until next time, thanks for watching.